Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners. Recently, Kazakhstan announced which company will be responsible for building its new nuclear plant near the village of Ulken, on the shores of Lake Balkhash. Unsurprisingly, the Kazakh authorities selected Rosatom, Russia's state atomic energy corporation. It was also revealed that another contender, China's CNNC, will build an additional nuclear reactor, essentially a consolation prize for a strategic ally. Offers from South Korea and France, who also participated in the tender, were not accepted. However, according to the Kazakh Atomic Energy Agency, all of the above companies will be part of a consortium tasked with constructing the plant. The decision to build a nuclear plant followed a national referendum held in October 2024, in which 71.12% of voters supported the project, with a turnout of 63.6%. The referendum took place amid a heavy pro-nuclear state campaign and the suppression of protests by organizations opposing nuclear power. Opponents argued that nuclear power is not clean, that there is still no clear solution for dealing with nuclear waste, and that choosing the Russian bid would increase Kazakhstan's political, economic, and energy dependence on Moscow. In addition, given the level of corruption in Kazakhstan, critics voiced concern over whether the plant could be operated to international safety standards. It is worth mentioning that Kazakhstan has a tragic nuclear legacy. It was a key site of the Soviet Union's nuclear program, which left long-lasting consequences on both public health and the environment. If you're interested in learning more about the survivors of the Soviet atomic program, I encourage you to read or listen to my story published a few months ago on Turan Tales, titled Atomic Kazakhstan, The Invisible Curse. I have included a link to the story in this week's newsletter. It's clear that Central Asia is facing a serious energy crisis, and new investments in this sector are both desperately needed and long overdue. Different countries in the region are experimenting with various types of renewable energy. Tajikistan with hydropower, Uzbekistan with wind farms, and most of them with solar panels. This week, we will explore the issue of energy deficiency in the region and how best to address it. Joining us is Anatole Boute, professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I asked him whether nuclear power is the right path for Central Asia, what needs to be done to improve access to cheap and clear energy, and whether Central Asian states are ready to cooperate in this vital sector. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hello. So today my guest is Anatole Boute, a professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, who specializes in the fields of energy and environmental and investment law. Hi, Anatole.
Hello, Agnieszka.
I invited you today to talk mainly about Kazakhstan and nuclear energy in Central Asia. Kazakhstan has recently announced that it will be Russia's Rosatom who will build its new nuclear power plant at the shores of Lake Balkhash. But it also tasked China with building another nuclear power plant. So why these two countries were picked and not France or South Korea, who also were part of the tender?
Yes, good question. Now, I don't have any specific insiders information on this. I'm looking at it from a more general perspective, following what's going on in the Central Asian energy sector. And clearly, both Russia and China likely offered, cost competitive projects and have expertise in the development of this kind of projects. And so this is probably this has probably been a very important aspect. At the same time, of course, it's possible to speculate that there are other, considerations that may have played a role, such as long-term partnerships alliances, etc., strategic considerations. But it's very difficult to determine whether that really played a role or not. So this is just speculation. At the same time, there's also, of course, question of technology. So not just a question of cost, but technology, expertise, etc. So all this must have played a role.
And so what kind of technology or what kind of costs were more advantageous in the Russia's and Chinese office as opposed to France or South Korea? Do you have any information about the details of those offers?
No, so I don't have any specific, as I said, insiders information on that at all. But what you have to look at is, it's the cost is one issue. There are probably also aspects of financing. There are issues of technology that play a role, and of expertise, of experience with the development of these kind of projects. All that is taken into account, and then behind the scenes, there are, of course, other possible considerations. Russia has been clear, for instance, in its new foreign policy strategy, that it was promoting the use of nuclear power abroad. So clearly, these kind of projects have the support of the Russian government. So this may have been a factor that also has played in support of Rosatom.
Russia is also building a nuclear power plant in Uzbekistan. And we know that both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan have faced acute electricity shortages over the past couple of years. So what were the reasons for those shortages?
So the electricity sector in Central Asia, I could say Central Asia more generally, it's not something that's limited to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Central Asia more generally is facing significant challenges in terms of its supply of electricity and in ensuring the supply-demand adequacy. And one important problem is, of course, that the infrastructure has not been sufficiently modernized. So significant investments are needed in the modernization of the infrastructure and then in the further development of the infrastructure. So power plants, for instance, are still, largely obsolete, outdated, and very old. They're running very old power stations that are energy intensive. So that's a problem, of course, from an environmental perspective, but it's also a problem from security and reliability perspective, because these old power plants, they're not producing flexibly, they're not producing as reliably as more recent installations, and certainly not as efficiently. And so in Kazakhstan, there's not been enough, just to simply answer the question, there's not been enough investments in electricity production. There's not been enough investments in electricity systems, in transmission. And that's probably also, a conclusion that can be shared in relation to Uzbekistan, though the situation is probably more acute in Kazakhstan. But that is not a sufficient answer to the question, because, it's too simplistic. We always, when we're looking at the question of security of supply, we always have to look also at the demand side. It's not enough to look at additional production, additional networks, modernizing this production and networks. We also have to look at the demand side, how electricity demand is growing, and in connection to that, the efficiency of demand, or the intensity, the energy intensity of the economy. And here there's a real problem as well. There's significant potential for more efficient energy use. And so the energy intensity is certainly something that has to be addressed if energy security is to be achieved in the most cost-effective way.
So, if you can explain to our listeners why the current, electricity supply is not cost effective. What are the reasons behind it? Is it because it's like an old Soviet system, or maybe this is just not a sustainable, system? Can we look at the technicalities a little bit more here?
Yes, so the Central Asian energy system was designed during Soviet times as an integrated system, Central Asian power system, and it was actually designed in a way that was originally very efficient, where the complementarities of every single Central Asian republic was built upon and developed. Hydropower in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the upper riparian countries, the gas-fired power generation in Uzbekistan, coal-fired power generation in Kazakhstan, and then exchanges of this electricity throughout the region, depending on the season, so as to allow water storage in the non-growing season, and then water releases in the growing season, and also supplies of gas from Uzbekistan to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to help them run their centralized combined heat and power stations to produce heat and electricity in the winter. So this was a combined system based on cooperation, based on sharing resources. And then, of course, when the Soviet Union collapsed, this cooperation was more difficult to maintain, and energy independence became kind of a priority. And so this kind of undermined the joint approach that was supposed to characterize and govern the system. So that's one problem. It's important to come back to a more common cooperative approach, cross-border management of these resources, and build on complementarities. So that has been difficult to maintain and to keep. The other point is summarizing one concept. It's investments, and you mentioned the Soviet infrastructure. Now that was initially, as I said, efficient. At least if you look at it from a purely energy perspective, there's the water dimension that's much more problematic. But from an energy perspective, they did they built it in an efficient way, but insufficient investments were made in maintaining, in modernizing, in updating the infrastructure. And of course, if you keep running assets that were built 50 years ago, well, they're going to collapse. And that's what's going on, essentially. So it's very important now to invest in modernizing this infrastructure. And when you're talking about investments, then you're talking about how should these investments be attracted? What framework should be put in place by these governments to incentivize investments, to finance these investments? And this brings us to then another dimension that's very important, and it's who's going to pay for these investments? And can the population, can the industry, can they afford additional financial burden of electricity, higher prices, higher tariffs that would be necessary to finance these investments? And here, so that's the challenge, really, is to bring prices towards more cost-reflective levels, market-based rates, so that's to make investments financially viable without undermining the affordability of energy supply. That's the main challenge, essentially, in a nutshell. It's very easy to say, very difficult to achieve, because it touches upon really, energy poverty, access to energy, and affordability. So these are very sensitive questions, and they're all interrelated issues. You won't solve the problem of energy insecurity by making energy unaffordable, and this will also create social unrest. I think this is also something that Kazakhstan, the case of Kazakhstan, illustrates. Right, we've seen in Kazakhstan social unrest. You've seen similar developments in Kyrgyzstan, where pricing decisions have been found to be very sensitive and have resulted in reactions, from the public, very, extreme reactions, where how can you convince the population to pay more for energy if the quality of supply is lacking? And so that's really the difficult situation they are in. On the one hand, you need to increase prices to finance projects. On the other hand, the population is not ready to accept higher prices if supply is not of greater quality. That's the challenge.
And has demand for electricity also increased in recent years? I mean, we know that, for example, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, they are like big hubs for cryptocurrency mining. And I wonder if it has anyhow, translated into greater energy needs.
Yes, energy demand is growing. But again, energy intensity is also a factor. Energy use has to be more efficient. And that's extremely important because when I mentioned the concept of investment, which is of course a very well known thing, I'm not just talking about investments in power plants, additional power plants, or additional networks. I'm also talking about investments in energy efficiency improvements on the demand side, on the end use side, to make energy more affordable. What you can do is it's not just a question of controlling prices. You can also control the amount of energy you're consuming, and not by limiting supply, but by investing in using energy more efficiently. And that's something that also has lag behind. Energy use is too intensive. It's too fossil fuel based. Certainly in some countries in the region. And that then is a burden. That intensity is a burden because, of course, it drives demand growth, but also it exposes consumers to higher prices when prices increase. Right? If you're more energy dependent, if the intensity of your energy dependence is higher, then you will be hit more when prices increase. And so, one way of solving that problem and achieving energy security in the region is to improve energy efficiency and use energy efficiency. That means helping consumers to use energy more efficiently through investments in modernization, in the refurbishment of their installations, of their houses, of their industrial facilities, and also to help them switch to more to cleaner and cheaper alternatives. And this is something we see, for instance, in Pakistan. In Pakistan, what we see is a significant shift towards solar PV, where end users are massively relying and buying solar PV technology as an alternative to the centralized grid. That's clean, and in many cases, it's also much cheaper now. So solar PV, rooftop solar PV is cheaper than existing coal power generation, at least when costs are reflected. And I'm not even talking about environmental costs. I'm simply talking about market prices. When all that is, when prices are cost reflective, then solar PV is actually cheaper. And that is something that's a transition that has to be incentivized so as to reduce energy intensity as well, so as to reduce energy dependence.
From what I know, Uzbekistan is somehow trying to enter, this system too. So I'm not an expert, obviously, but I've seen some sort of attempt to introduce solar energy.
Absolutely.
So how do you see the region right now and those attempts to switch to clean energy? Is the nuclear energy being like the most promoted now in the region, or maybe some other sources of energy?
Well, first of all, it's debatable whether nuclear energy is really clean. I think many would disagree with the characterization of nuclear energy as clean. It's, to a certain extent, it's carbon free, so it's low carbon. But it's not necessarily clean. You have many environmental challenges associated with nuclear energy, including the question of waste treatment, and that's why it's so controversial. Or that's why it has been so controversial, because we see kind of a shift in perception more recently. Nuclear energy is one dimension, but that's really massive or large projects. I think when you're talking about clean alternatives, the focus is more on solar PV and wind. And then solar PV, and then of course the difference between utility scale investments, large investments, and then the example of solar PV, solar rooftop panels that are at installation level and even accessible for households. So that we need to first define what we mean with clean energy technologies. Now, then we need to look at the cost. That's very important. Now, nuclear energy, talk about large installations, is actually a very expensive technology. Very difficult to implement these projects. There have been many delays on different parts of the world. So there are different projects to put in place. They're actually very expensive to build these installations. So it's not cheap. Certainly not a cheap option. And what we also see at the same time, and I think that's a massive opportunity right now, it's a significant. We're seeing of the last decade and more a significant reduction in the cost of clean energies. For instance, solar PV. It's a significant decline. It's really important because right now solar PV, as I said in my previous answer, solar PV is cheaper than coal power. And I'm not even talking about new coal power investments. I'm talking about existing coal power generation. In many jurisdictions, solar PV is cheaper, even when you don't factor in the environmental damage that is caused by these other by fossil fuels. So on a pure cost basis, it is cheaper. So you're asking me how the region is doing. Well, we see actually ambition in the area. For instance, Kazakhstan has some ambitious targets. There is interest from foreign companies to develop very large investments in renewable energy, in wind generation, for instance, in solar with battery storage projects. So there is ambition. Uzbekistan as well. And there is massive potential. The region has huge potential that's largely untapped. And that's, of course, very good news, because that means that they can access what is now a very cheap source of energy in significant volume, significant amounts. And so I have to admit that I don't fully understand, why nuclear power, and why not go fully for the clean energy alternatives. Storage is still relatively expensive. The costs are going down. But the problem really then, if you think about solar PV, wind, is these are variable sources of energy production. So you need to manage that flexibility. But there are many ways of managing this flexibility. It's more difficult, of course, in systems such as the ones we're looking at and discussing today, Kazakhstan, for instance, systems where the infrastructure hasn't been sufficiently modernized and where assets are old and don't function or don't provide a lot of flexibility. And so there's a lack of so-called maneuverable capacity or flexible capacity to compensate even existing assets. They cannot ramp up and down as rapidly as you would need for solar. So investments in flexibility, in sources of flexibility are needed. But my question is whether nuclear power is such source of flexibility. Is it flexible enough? It's a question that has to be asked. Is it compatible with the rapid deployment that is needed in solar PV and in wind energy? And I think the latter has to take place because, and not just from an environmental or climate change perspective, but simply because it's the cheapest source of energy today. Solar PV is the cheapest source of energy. And so it has to be deployed simply to keep costs, to drive costs low, to reduce energy dependence, to reduce dependence on the volatility of fossil fuel prices. So the region would benefit from that transition. Pakistan it is what Pakistan is trying to do, and it's driven by end users. They're relying on solar PV because it's cheaper. So if you're going to deploy massively these renewable technologies, then you need a source of flexibility in the system. It can come from battery systems, or it can come from existing installations that are flexible enough, or new projects that would provide that flexibility. And I think that has to be really very carefully reflected upon by the policymakers. How I think the priority should be, going for the cheapest source. That means solar PV and wind, and then make sure that sufficient flexibility is there, and of course that the network systems are sufficiently developed to absorb these new sources of energy. And there has to be a careful reflection as to how this is best implemented. And I'm not sure this is exactly what's going on, because we're talking about new nuclear power stations, we're talking about new coal-fired power stations to be built by Russia. In principle, these could be sources of flexibility, but are they the most logical and obvious source of flexibility and the cheapest source of flexibility? That's a question I think that has to be asked.
The argument that I have heard, but obviously I'm no expert, is that, wind power plants or that solar panels are not able to, to meet the demand in Central Asia today. Is this true? Or maybe you can tell us something more about this technology?
Well, you would have to make, of course, more investments in the deployment of these technologies. Of course, not right now with the existing capacity installed, we wouldn't meet demand. But as I said, this is a technology that is now relatively cheap thanks to significant cost reductions that have been achieved in the last decade. So that's a cost benefit that's now available and that should be taken advantage of. So I see no reason why this cannot be achieved. I'm aware of studies actually that say the opposite. That say that it's actually entirely possible for Uzbekistan, for instance, to achieve its energy supply fully on a decarbonized basis, clean energy sources, by 2050. And that actually would be the cheapest source of doing it. Is also one of the conclusions of an existing low carbon roadmap for the Uzbekistan electricity sector. So the studies I'm aware of, they're actually supporting the deployment of renewable energy and the rapid decarbonization, so transition to clean energy sources, as a way not just, again, I insist, not just of addressing environmental challenges, but really also as the cheapest way of securing energy. Because also that's what shields end users from supply shocks, from all the issues that characterize insufficient energy, fossil fuel, access to fossil fuels. But what is important to understand is in Uzbekistan as well is the gas situation in terms of gas production and gas supply demand adequacy. There's not enough gas. And there's not enough gas because, well, you could argue because of insufficient investment in gas extraction, exploration, but also because of inefficiency, as I've pointed out, of the infrastructure as a result of insufficient investments in the modernization of gas pipelines, of gas-fired power plants, of gas distribution systems, and of end users, appliances, and equipment. At the same time, and as a result of this, Uzbekistan is no longer in a position to export as much gas, for instance, to China as they would want. And that's a lost opportunity, right? This is revenues, this is hard currency that you are not earning because the energy system is energy intensive, because it's characterized by energy losses, and because of dependency on gas in the domestic system, because of not having transitioned yet towards low carbon energy sources. So that transition, it's the transition towards cheaper energy, but it also then frees domestic resources that can then be used for export purposes, that can be used for other purposes like developing a petrochemical industry, possibly in Uzbekistan. Right now, energy dependence, energy intensity is creating problems of, I would argue, of unaffordability, inefficiency, and lost opportunities in terms of export revenues.
Before the Kazakh referendum about whether or not it should build a nuclear energy power plant, its opponents had a number of arguments against building a nuclear power plant. So, can we look at these arguments right now, and maybe you can tell us what you think about them and whether or not they make sense to you? So, the first argument, which we already touched upon, is that nuclear energy is not clean because the radioactive waste has to be stored somewhere, right? So, how would you answer to this argument?
Yes, this is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not aware of any proper solution to that problem. So this is a very valid argument.
So what happens to a radioactive waste that comes from a nuclear power plant? I mean, so what Kazakhstan would actually do with this waste?
Well, it would have to be treated, and then it would have to be stored somewhere for millions of years, basically.
Mm-hmm. Somewhere like, I mean, what kind of place, for example? I mean, where such waste is stored in the world today?
Well, I don't think there is any. Yeah, also there's some kind of depleted mines or areas where you keep it, but it's never really safe, right? So that's certainly something you have to think about. I don't think anyone has a final answer yet to that question, and it really is not just a question for now; it's a question for the for the future generations as well to take into account, and questions of also signaling, like where the waste is for future generations in when they might not have even the knowledge that there is this kind of radioactive waste here. How are you going to tell them in a way that can you make sure that they're aware of this? We're talking about very, very long time frames. So, yeah, this is an issue.
The second argument that was used against the building of the nuclear power plant was that it will most likely be Russia to build the power plant, and that will only further increase Kazakhstan's dependency on Moscow, which obviously is not ideal, to put it mildly. How do you see this?
Well, yes, I see this also as a valid point to raise. It's a different kind of dependency, at least to some extent, to gas dependencies, but it's still a dependency. You can talk about technology dependency. You can talk about dependency in terms of finance, investment, an operational dependency. You can talk about a dependency also in the supply of the fuel, because although Kazakhstan has uranium, this uranium has to be enriched before you can use it as a fuel in your reactor. So that technology is something that also would have to come from abroad. So there are many kind of technologies and dependencies that would be created or reinforced. Yes, and then it's of course dependencies are not necessarily a bad thing. But they have to be managed, right? So it's to Kazakhstan to see whether they are ready to accept additional dependencies to the dependencies that are already there, and also the extent to which these dependencies can potentially be disrupted in case of potential deterioration of the relation between the countries, which is something they have to think about, because it's, again, maybe not something that matters today, but it's going to have an impact for the foreseeable future. So for future administrations, future generations. So that is something that has to be managed. And if anything, the energy crisis in Europe and in the world of 2022 shows that these dependencies can be dangerous. Supply dependencies, but also infrastructure dependencies, investment dependencies are something to manage very carefully.
Did you have a moment that you believed or maybe hoped that it will be France to build the nuclear power plant in Kazakhstan?
Not really. I mean, hoped maybe, but I think it was pretty clear from the outset
Mhm.
that Russia would have very good chances in the selection process. And also, this is what could be kind of perceived from the political mood, I think, at the moment.
The third argument that was used by the opponents of the nuclear power plant in Kazakhstan was that due to the corrupt nature of the Kazakh system, it is not safe to rely on nuclear power because obviously we know that there have been quite a few nuclear power incidents or catastrophes in the world, right? One of them was Chernobyl, which obviously is still remembered in the so-called post-Soviet space. Do you think that this argument is somehow solid? Because obviously we know that now nuclear power plants are built using a different technology, right? A newer technology. But is it still dangerous to build them?
Well, I mean, you're referring to Chernobyl. I would refer to Fukushima in Japan, which is a more recent example and shows how a highly technologically advanced country, with extensive experience of nuclear power generation, how they still faced a massive disaster and really struggled to contain it. So there are clearly safety issues. Now, I think the number of incidents have been limited, but they're there. Now, how that applies to Kazakhstan, I mean, whether Kazakhstan is more exposed to this kind of risks or not, I don't know. What I do know is that there is a question of water availability, and that's something that Kazakhstan needs to think about. These are installations that require quite a lot of water. So will there be sufficient water in the foreseeable future to operate the plant? Is something they have to carefully think about. The impact, yes, on the environment, also in terms of water resources, is a consideration. And again, I would like to bring back the question of dependency. Look at what's going on in Ukraine with the fighting that's going on in the vicinity of a nuclear power station, where the nuclear power station is part of some kind of military activities and threats. So that's something to take into account as well. Without I'm not saying that there's any, and I don't know how immediate that risk is or not, but it's certainly something to at least take into account when planning for these kind of projects.
So, if you could advise the Central Asian governments to kind of wrap it up, what would you advise each and every one of them? Because obviously, the situation in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, countries that have water, is a little bit different to the situation of Turkmenistan, which is a desert, in fact, but has gas, and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So, if we could look at each of those countries and see what would be like possibly the best solution for energy insufficiency.
Yes. So first, in more general terms, to take a regional perspective, what you have just outlined are different energy benefits, energy resource bases that each country has. And that this is an opportunity for cooperation between these countries. So I think that the first thing I would try to emphasize, but of course it's well understood in the region, it's just difficult to implement, but emphasize again the importance of cooperation and building on these diverse resource bases that characterize the region and try to develop that based on cooperation, taking into account that climate change is happening and is affecting and will increasingly affect water availability in the region. And so cooperation on scarce water resources, for instance, is absolutely critical. But at the same time, this can be achieved by cooperation in the supply of electricity, by taking advantage of an interconnected system. So to look at, in my view, what is important is to look at the question of energy security, energy supply, not from a national perspective, as you invited me to do, but more from a regional perspective. Trying to take advantage of the multiple advantages that each of them represents, and try to, and of course it's easy to say, but still I think it's important, try to move away from the concept of energy independence. I've said before that there are risks associated to energy dependence. At the same time, there are also risks associated with the pursuit of energy self-sufficiency or energy independence, because you're blocking out essentially the advantages of cooperation. Central Asia really is an example of that, where there's a lot to gain from bringing their advantages, their energy advantages, benefits, their energy resource bases together, and then energy and water resources, to try to manage them in sense of in a spirit of cooperation, taking account the needs of all parties. But the second point, it is also a shared issue across the region, is the issue of energy intensity. And I think that's what the priority should be to reduce energy and water, you could argue, energy and water intensity. So produce more and consume more efficient. Again, it's easy to say, but it is, and it should be the priority focus. Efficiency, efficient use of energy, efficient use of water in production, in all parts of the energy value chain. And then and this can be achieved, for instance, it's one of the available options is the deployment of clean technologies. That again, the region has significant potential there to benefit from that, from these major technological advances and cost reductions that have been achieved. The region has a lot to gain as well from its partnership with China in this area. China has, is the by far most important supplier of clean technologies, supplies these technologies at very low price now, and that's an advantage that can be built upon to achieve, to address the problems that we've discussed today. So these are issues that are shared and strategies that can be developed throughout the region. So I would kind of rather focus on these more very general approaches rather than propose a specific strategy for each country.
And have you seen already some examples of cooperation when it comes to energy in the region?
Yes, absolutely. There was a period where cooperation was very difficult in the energy sector, hydropower sector, but now I think we're at a stage where cooperation is more and more important and more actively discussed and activated. So in the sense that there are very specific cooperation projects, for instance, in the area of hydropower generation, supply of electricity from hydropower, and development of the infrastructure, where the countries are working together, and that's extremely important, and it's a very significant development, and so that they are actually trying to work together on that and benefit from this in a shared way. Yeah.
Thank you, Anatole. One more question towards the end. Is there anything that you would like to add that you think that is important and our listeners should know about energy in the region?
Just to say that the energy transition, that is much talked about, and that is slowly unfolding, that this energy transition actually presents significant benefits, I think. That is for the end users, for the population, for the industry. And there are already many examples of this. And I think that should now be the absolute priority of the government, of the population, of the local industry, of foreign investors in the country, of donors and investors more generally, to harness these opportunities and these benefits. It is not just a necessity from a climate change perspective, both mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change, but it also brings very clearly benefits in terms of access to cheap, affordable, clean energy. So we're now at a stage in the development of technologies where we can now say that this is the way to go. It's clear. And so I hope the only question is how fast this transition is going to take place. And I can only hope that Central Asia is going to be at the forefront of this transition. That Central Asia is going to cooperate as a region, and then, cooperate also with its neighbors. And that means, of course, Russia, cooperation with Russia, and certainly also with China and other countries. At the same time, as I said, dependencies have to be managed, but cooperation is absolutely crucial. And clean energies here are, in my view, the solution, because clean energy is about energy production using domestic, local resources, sun, wind. And so that is something that clearly also helps address the problem of dependency that we've been discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Anatole. It was really a great overview, and good luck with your work.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka, for the opportunity to talk to you.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.